When a confident white cop walked into the courtroom, he thought this was just another open and shut case, until the black woman he accused stood up and the truth began to unravel with every word she spoke. It was early morning in a packed courthouse when Clarence Monroe, a seasoned police officer, strutted to the stand, convinced that his word alone would seal the fate of Danielle Harris, the black woman he claimed had assaulted him. Clad in his crisp uniform and brimming with smug confidence, Officer Monroe recounted a story of alleged resistance and aggression, painting Danielle as a threat. The crowd listened, many already assuming they knew how this would end. Danielle, meanwhile, sat quietly at the defense table. Her white blouse pressed her posture, composed, her eyes observant. Though she said nothing, something about her presence hinted that this case was far more complex than it seemed. Danielle's young attorney, Marcus Bell, nervously shuffled papers beside her, aware of how deeply this case had stirred public interest. Monroe's account sounded well-rehearsed, even theatrical. He accused Danielle of refusing to cooperate, escalating the situation, and attempting to reach for his service weapon. Gasps rippled through the courtroom, yet Danielle's expression remained unreadable. Her silence wasn't weakness, it was calculation. And when the judge called her to the stand, she didn't just step forward as a defendant. She stood as someone ready to change everything. What Officer Monroe and the courtroom didn't know was that Danielle Harris wasn't just any woman. She carried with her not only the truth, but a past of disciplined strength and leadership that was about to shake the very foundation of Monroe's fabricated tale. The courtroom seemed to exhale all at once as Danielle Harris rose from her seat, moving toward the witness stand with deliberate grace. Every eye in the room followed her, and even those who had dismissed her moments earlier now leaned in, sensing something had shifted. Her voice, when she spoke, was calm and resolute, carrying the kind of weight that made people listen. "Before I begin," she said, looking directly at the prosecutor, "I need to state clearly. Officer Monroe's account is not just inaccurate, it is deliberately misleading." A hushed murmur spread across the room, and the prosecutor narrowed his eyes, preparing for a rebuttal. But Danielle didn't flinch. She began recounting the events of that night with clarity and precision, every detail delivered with the measured confidence of someone who had nothing to hide. She explained that she had been standing outside a closed storefront checking her phone for directions when Monroe approached her and shined a flashlight directly into her face. She asked him politely why she was being questioned, but instead of responding with reason, he raised his voice, accusing her of being uncooperative. "I wasn't trespassing, causing a disturbance, or doing anything illegal," she stated firmly. "I simply asked why I was being asked for my ID." Her tone remained composed, but there was an edge of fire beneath it, controlled but undeniable. She then described how Monroe grabbed her arm without warning. "I told him I didn't consent to being touched," she continued. "That's when he tightened his grip and said, and I quote, 'Women like you need to learn how to listen.'" That sentence hung in the air like a thunderclap. The gallery gasped, and the judge banged his gavel in a futile attempt to restore order. Officer Monroe shifted uncomfortably in his seat, no longer the pillar of confidence he had been just an hour earlier. The prosecutor tried to undercut her statement, asking if she had any proof. Without missing a beat, Danielle answered, "No, because his body camera mysteriously malfunctioned that night." That subtle accusation turned every gaze toward Monroe, whose jaw visibly clenched as he looked away. Danielle's testimony didn't rely on theatrics, it was built on clarity, truth, and a quiet strength that unnerved those who doubted her. Her lawyer, Marcus Bell, watched with growing awe. He had believed in her case, but now he was seeing something else entirely. A woman with the presence and poise of someone who had seen far worse than a courtroom. As Danielle finished her account of being slammed against the patrol car and falsely arrested, the silence in the room was no longer one of doubt. It was the dawning realization that this trial wasn't going to go the way Monroe had expected. The air inside the courtroom grew heavier with every word Danielle spoke. But it wasn't until Marcus Bell called for a recess just long enough to prepare what he hinted would be a pivotal piece of evidence that the energy in the room truly changed. When the court reconvened, he walked calmly to the bench and presented a USB drive to the bailiff. "Your Honor," he said, voice steadier than it had been all morning, "the defense submits a video recorded by a bystander during Officer Monroe's arrest of my client." The room went still as the screen lit up. The footage, grainy and shot from inside a car across the street, showed a clear view of Monroe confronting Danielle. The audio was muffled, but Monroe's voice rang out loud and sharp. "Don't make this harder than it needs to be." Then came Danielle's voice, even and unshaken. "I'm not resisting. Let go of my arm." Gasps rippled through the gallery as the video captured Monroe slamming her against his patrol car. But the most devastating moment came seconds later, when Monroe could be heard sneering, "Women like you don't get to question me." The judge's gavel struck hard against the bench, demanding order, but the courtroom was already buzzing. Journalists scribbled furiously, and Monroe's fellow officers seated in the back row in quiet support just hours earlier now exchanged uneasy glances. Marcus allowed the silence to linger before turning back to Danielle. "Miss Harris," he said gently, "did you ever at any point reach for Officer Monroe's weapon, as he claimed?" Her answer was swift and unwavering. Absolutely not. That accusation was fabricated to justify his use of force. Monroe's once confident demeanor had evaporated. He sat rigid in his chair, lips tight, forehead damp with sweat. Marcus turned to the judge. "We intend to show that not only was my client wrongfully arrested, but that this arrest was part of a broader pattern of misconduct." At that moment, Marcus retrieved a file from his briefcase. "Officer Monroe has been the subject of multiple complaints, excessive force, racially biased policing, and intimidation, all ignored or quietly buried." He handed the file to the judge, who scanned the documents with furrowed brows. The jury leaned forward in their seats. Danielle remained quiet during all of this, her composure unshaken. She had already told her truth. Now it was being corroborated not just by the video, but by Monroe's own history. It was clear the wall of credibility he had once stood behind was cracking and fast. And somewhere between the shaky footage and the gavel's repeated cries for silence, the courtroom began to see Danielle not as a defendant, but as the victim of a deeply flawed system. As the weight of the evidence mounted and Officer Monroe sat frozen behind the plaintiff's table, Marcus Bell made one final move that would redefine the course of the trial and shake the very courtroom to its core. With quiet authority, he stood once again and announced, "Your Honor, the defense would now like to call the defendant, Ms. Danielle Harris, back to the stand, this time, to speak not only as a citizen, but as a veteran." There was a collective shift in the room. Whispers swirled in the gallery as Danielle smoothed the sleeves of her navy blue blazer and walked with the poise of a seasoned officer. When she took her place on the witness stand, her gaze was calm, but resolute. "Please state your full name and occupation for the court," Marcus asked. Danielle straightened her posture. "Lieutenant Commander Danielle Harris, United States Navy SEAL, retired." Gasps echoed across the chamber. Even Judge Warner looked momentarily stunned, his gavel suspended in midair. Monroe's expression drained of color. Danielle continued, her voice unwavering. "I served this country for 2 decades. I led teams in combat zones, conducted high-risk extractions, and trained elite units in threat assessment and de-escalation. I know exactly what force looks like and how to avoid it." She turned her head slightly, locking eyes with Monroe. "That night I wasn't aggressive. I was assertive. I wasn't threatening. I was asking questions, reasonable ones, and that officer used my voice as a reason to use force." Marcus stepped forward. "Lieutenant Commander, during your time in service, were you ever trained to recognize abuse of authority?" "Absolutely," she replied. "And I recognized it the moment he laid hands on me." Her words rang with a steady authority, sharpened not by anger, but by lived experience. She wasn't just dismantling Monroe's claims. She was dismantling the system that allowed them to exist. The jury was no longer just listening. They were watching, absorbing, transforming. When asked whether her military training influenced how she responded to the confrontation, Danielle nodded. "It taught me how to stay calm in chaos, how to survive without escalating. That night I relied on my training to keep myself alive, not to fight back, but to stay grounded." And in that moment she didn't just reclaim her dignity, she claimed power. Power not granted by a uniform or a badge, but by integrity, resilience, and a truth so clear it cut through every lie spoken before it. As she stepped down from the stand, heads turned not out of pity, but out of respect. And Officer Monroe, who had once entered the room, smug and certain, now looked like a man standing at the edge of collapse. The moment Danielle Harris returned to her seat, her testimony still echoing through the courtroom, the atmosphere shifted from tense to electric. The jury was no longer composed of skeptical faces. They looked like people who had just witnessed the unraveling of a long-held lie. Officer Monroe sat rigid, gripping the edge of the table, as though it were the last thing anchoring him to his crumbling reality. His once practiced smugness had vanished, replaced by a pale, shaken expression. The judge, after a long pause, finally turned to the prosecutor. "Mr. Lane, would the state like to proceed with redirect?" The prosecutor. Richard Lane, a sharp-tongued veteran of the courtroom, stood hesitantly. He was no longer in control of the narrative, and he knew it. His voice carried an edge of desperation as he called Monroe back to the stand to clarify certain inconsistencies. Monroe's walk to the stand was slow, almost reluctant. The uniform that once drew admiration now felt more like a costume one that no longer fit the man wearing it. As Lane began his questions, it was obvious the strategy had changed from dominance to damage control. Officer Monroe Lane began trying to steady the tone. "You've heard the defendant's testimony. Would you like to respond?" Monroe's voice cracked slightly as he replied, "Her account is exaggerated. I was doing my job." But the words lacked conviction. When asked about the video footage, Monroe fumbled. "It doesn't show everything." She was hostile before the recording started. It was a weak defense, and everyone knew it. Then Marcus Bell stood again, calm, measured, but with a blade behind every word. "Officer Monroe," he began, "you claim the defendant reached for your weapon. Do you have any physical evidence to support that claim? Any fingerprints? Any independent witness?" Monroe stammered. "No, but I know what I saw." Marcus stepped closer. "The court, however, has seen something else, something that contradicts every critical element of your testimony." He paused, then added, "Tell me, officer, does it embarrass you to know that the woman you attempted to silence with force has not only served this country with distinction, but did so while upholding the very values you abandoned that night?" The courtroom fell into a silence so deep it felt like the building itself was holding its breath. Monroe stared ahead, unable to respond. The truth had finally caught up to him, and it showed in the slump of his shoulders and the flicker of defeat in his eyes. Judge Warner leaned forward, steepling his fingers. "Thank you, Mr. Bell." "No further questions." Marcus nodded once. "No, Your Honor." And as Monroe stepped down each step heavier than the last, it was clear the man who had once felt untouchable was now just another witness to his own undoing. As Officer Monroe returned to his seat, visibly rattled and void of the bravado that had marked his earlier testimony, the courtroom felt like it had entered the eye of a storm. Judge Warner's gavel echoed once more, restoring order, but the collective weight of what had just transpired lingered in every corner of the chamber. All eyes shifted back to the defense table, where Marcus Bell stood once again. This time his confidence was no longer strained. It was rooted in truth and in the knowledge that the momentum had turned. "Your Honor," he said, "the defense requests to present one final piece of evidence." The judge nodded cautiously. "Proceed." From his briefcase, Marcus pulled a folder plain leather-bound and thick with documents. "Ladies and gentlemen of the jury," he began, holding the folder aloft. "What you've witnessed today is not an isolated incident. Officer Monroe's misconduct didn't begin the night he arrested Lieutenant Commander Harris. It's part of a pattern. He handed copies to the judge and jury, and as the contents were revealed, the temperature in the courtroom seemed to drop. Inside were formal complaints filed over the years, allegations of excessive force, racially charged language abuse, of power, all bearing Monroe's name. Some had been quietly dismissed. Others had been settled out of court. But together, they painted a damning picture. The murmurs returned louder now. In the gallery, several of Monroe's fellow officers shifted uncomfortably. What had begun as a case against one woman now looked more like a reckoning with an entire system. Judge Warner's face darkened as he flipped through the reports. "Mr. Bell," he said, "are you suggesting the department failed to address these complaints?" "I'm not suggesting, Your Honor," Marcus replied. "I'm proving it." Then he turned to the jury. "You've heard Lieutenant Commander Harris' testimony. You've seen the video. And now you see the Paterna system that empowered an officer to escalate a peaceful encounter into an act of aggression because he assumed he could." Danielle sat quietly beside him, her hands folded neatly, eyes locked forward. But beneath that quiet exterior was a storm of emotion. For years, she had served with honor in places where survival depended on trust and accountability. And yet here in the country, she defended, she had nearly been silenced by the very institutions sworn to uphold justice. Now, finally, the tide was turning. Not because she fought back violently, but because she stood her ground with truth, discipline, and unshakable composure. As the courtroom processed the weight of this final blow, it was no longer just a trial about a wrongful arrest. It had become something larger, a moment of clarity, a confrontation between truth and institutional failure. And while Officer Monroe stared blankly at the table before him, the realization was clear. The badge he once used as a shield had become the very evidence of his undoing. The courtroom sat in suffocating silence as Judge Warner leaned forward, clearly unsettled by the pattern of complaints now part of the official record. But the real moment of reckoning came when Marcus Bell stood once more and turned toward the jury. "Your Honor, with the court's permission, I ask that Lieutenant Commander Harris be allowed to address the jury directly one final time." The judge hesitated for a breath, then gave a single nod. "Proceed." Danielle Harris stood slowly, her presence commanding the room before she even spoke. There was no anger in her eyes, just the steady resolve of someone who had spent a lifetime standing up in the face of adversity. She stepped forward, her voice unwavering. "I didn't ask for this fight," she said plainly. "I didn't come looking for trouble. I was walking home after visiting a friend. I stood on a sidewalk, checked my phone, and asked why a police officer needed to see my ID. That's all it took. She let that hang for a moment. What followed was not just about power, it was about perception. About who people assume you are and who they think you're allowed to be. Her voice was calm, but with a simmering weight behind every word. Officer Monroe didn't see a Navy SEAL. He didn't see a combat veteran or a woman who had spent 2 decades defending this country. He saw someone he thought he could control. She turned slowly to face the jurors. I kept calm, not because I was afraid, but because I've learned that staying calm is how you survive. I didn't raise my voice. I didn't raise my hands. But even that wasn't enough to be treated with dignity. Her eyes shifted to Monroe, who now looked hollowed out, shrinking under her gaze. I wasn't a threat to him that night, but I was a challenge to the way he saw authority, and that's what he couldn't tolerate. By the time Danielle stepped back to her seat, the room was changed. The air felt different, not tense, but heavy, with the weight of truth. Marcus didn't need to say another word. The jury had heard everything they needed. This wasn't just about proving Danielle's innocence. It was about something larger, about justice catching up to someone who had hidden behind a badge for too long, and about a woman who refused to be intimidated or defined by anyone's expectations. In that moment, the court didn't just see a defendant. They saw a soldier, a survivor, and a symbol of courage. And Officer Monroe. He was no longer the man in charge. He was the man who had finally been seen for who he truly was. The tension in the courtroom lingered long after Danielle returned to her seat, the final echo of her words still resonating through the space like a pulse. The judge instructed both parties to prepare for closing arguments, but the atmosphere suggested the verdict had already begun to form in the minds of the jury. Marcus Bell gave his closing remarks with the quiet gravity of a man who no longer needed to persuade. He simply reminded the jury of what they had seen with their own eyes. A woman of honor, dignity, and service dragged into a courtroom. Not because she was guilty, but because she had dared to ask a question. This case, he said, his voice steady, is not about resisting arrest. It's about resisting injustice. His words, simple and sincere, cut through the noise. The prosecutor tried to recover lost ground, offering the jury a cautious plea to consider the pressures of law enforcement to avoid being swayed by emotion. But by now, that argument felt hollow. No one in that room could unsee the video footage. No one could unhear the tone Monroe used. And no one could forget the image of Danielle Harris, calm, composed, and utterly unwilling to bend under pressure. The jury retired to deliberate, and for a long while the courtroom remained still. Danielle sat beside Marcus, her hands folded, her eyes fixed on the floor, not out of defeat, but in solemn anticipation. This wasn't just about her freedom. It was about accountability. It was about something far greater than one courtroom, one cop, or even one woman. When the jury returned, their expressions were clear, serious, but resolved. The forewoman, an older woman with silver hair and a firm voice, stood as the judge asked, "Has the jury reached a verdict?" "We have, Your Honor," she replied. She unfolded the paper, cleared her throat, and read, "In the case of the State versus Danielle Harris, we find the defendant not guilty on all counts." A wave of emotion swept through the courtroom, gasps, tears, even a few audible exhales of relief. But it wasn't over yet. The forewoman continued. "Furthermore, we strongly recommend that Officer Clarence Monroe's conduct be investigated by Internal Affairs, and that appropriate disciplinary action be pursued." Judge Warner nodded solemnly, the weight of the trial evident in his voice. "This court acknowledges the jury's recommendation. Officer Monroe, I suggest you seek legal counsel." Monroe sat stone-faced, but his eyes betrayed the truth his shield of silence had shattered. Outside, the world was already waiting, but as Danielle stood and looked out over the courtroom, her message was clear. This wasn't just a personal victory. It was a stand for every person who had ever been silenced, doubted, or profiled. And now justice had finally spoken. As the courtroom emptied and the echo of the gavel faded into the distance, Danielle Harris stepped out onto the courthouse steps into the golden glow of the late afternoon sun. The crowd waiting outside erupted, not in chaos, but in reverent silence, giving space to a woman who had just won far more than a legal battle. Cameras clicked, microphones were thrust toward her, journalists clamored for statements, but Danielle didn't speak, not yet. She stood tall in her navy blue blazer eyes, steady posture, unshaken. It was Marcus Bell who stepped forward first, shielding her from the initial wave of questions. "Lieutenant Commander Harris will speak when she's ready," he said. "But understand this, today's verdict wasn't just about one officer's lie. It was about a system that must be held to a higher standard." Later that evening, away from the cameras, Danielle returned to her modest home on the outskirts of town. The lights were low, the house quiet. The folded American flag on her mantel caught the last streaks of daylight through the window, a symbol of service sacrifice, and now a different kind of battle fought and won. As she sat down, her thoughts wandered not to Monroe, not to the courtroom, but to every young black woman who might one day find herself standing alone against a wall of false accusations and unchecked authority. Danielle had once led troops through enemy territory. She had defused bombs, conducted covert operations, and fought for her country overseas. But this quiet, relentless struggle for truth at home had been the most personal, the most painful, and perhaps the most important mission of her life. That night, her phone buzzed non-stop. Messages from veterans she had served with, the women's rights advocates, community leaders, and even strangers who had watched the trial unfold on television. Each message carried the same sentiment: gratitude. She hadn't just cleared her name. She had exposed a rot in the system, one that could no longer be ignored. Her story had given others permission to speak up, to question, to resist. And somewhere in the middle of the night, Danielle rose and stood in front of her bathroom mirror. She looked at her reflection, not searching for strength, but recognizing it. For the first time in a long while, she allowed herself to feel the victory. Not just the courtroom win, but the reclamation of her voice, her dignity, and her truth. Tomorrow would bring more questions, more challenges, and perhaps even retaliation. But she was ready. Because Danielle Harris hadn't just survived the system. She had faced it and made it blink first. Weeks later, the ripple effects of the trial had reached far beyond the courthouse. Officer Clarence Monroe was officially dismissed from the force and indicted for perjury and misconduct. His once loyal colleagues distanced themselves, and a formal investigation uncovered years of abuse buried beneath departmental silence. Meanwhile, Danielle Harris quietly resumed her life, not as a victim, but as a victor. She turned down media interviews and talk shows, choosing instead to mentor young women in her community, especially those from marginalized backgrounds. Her story had become a beacon, not just of justice, but of dignity reclaimed in the face of oppression. At a local veterans event, she stood at a podium and said, "I wore the uniform to protect this country, but I had to walk into that courtroom to protect my name." Both battles mattered. The crowd stood in silence, then erupted in applause. And here lies the truth we all must carry forward. Real strength isn't measured by how loud we fight, but by how steady we stand when the world tries to push us down. Danielle didn't win because she shouted. She won because she held her ground with truth, honor, and clarity. If this story inspired you, leave a comment below. Tell us about a time you stood up for what was right, even when it wasn't easy. Don't forget to like, share, and subscribe for more powerful stories like this one. Because sometimes the most extraordinary heroes are the ones we nearly overlooked.